The rain fell with a quiet, persistent grief, clinging to the marble angels and manicured rose bushes of the memorial garden like a second skin. It was a soft, insidious drizzle, the kind that soaked through the finest wool coat and chilled a man to his very bones. Thomas Beckett felt the cold not in his limbs but in the hollow space where his heart used to be. For a year that space had been a frozen cavern, and today's ceremony was merely an echo within it. He stood under the shelter of a large black umbrella held by a silent assistant, his gaze fixed on the simple granite bench that served as Elena's monument. In loving memory of Elena Beckett. A light extinguished too soon. The words were a lie. Elena had not been a light. She had been a fire. A brilliant, untamable conflagration that had warmed his world and burned away the shadows. A fire that a storm off the coast had supposedly quenched one terrible night, leaving him with nothing but ash and memory. The mourners milled around him, a flock of expensive black suits and somber dresses. They offered their condolences with practiced sincerity, their whispers of "so sorry for your loss," and she was a wonderful woman blurring into a meaningless drone. He knotted his face, a mask of stoic sorrow that he had perfected over the past 12 months. They saw the billionaire, the titan of industry, weathering his tragedy with formidable grace. They did not see the man who woke each morning to the crushing silence of an empty bed, the man who still caught the scent of her perfume on a phantom breeze and felt his carefully constructed world splinter. His assistant, a young eager man named Peterson, leaned in. "Sir, the press is gathering at the East Gate. Perhaps we should—" "Let them wait," Thomas said, his voice a low rasp. He did not want to leave. Leaving felt like a betrayal, like the final shovelful of earth on her coffin. He needed another minute, another moment to pretend she could feel his presence here, that some part of her soul lingered among the weeping angels. He remembered her laugh, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and the way she would trace the lines on his palm when she was thinking. He remembered the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she was arguing a point, her passion for justice that often put her at odds with his more pragmatic, ruthless world. She was the balance he never knew he needed, and without her he was dangerously askew. That was when the whisper sliced through the rain-soaked quiet. "Your wife is still alive." The voice was soft, almost childlike, yet it carried an impossible weight. It cut through the polite murmurs and the steady patter of the rain with the sharp finality of shattering glass. Thomas froze, the muscles in his back coiling tight. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, that his grief had finally conjured a demon to torment him with the one lie he could not bear. He turned slowly, his movements stiff. The umbrella shifted and he saw her. She stood just beyond the inner circle of mourners, a small, solitary figure swallowed by an oversized, rain-darkened hoodie. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her frame thin and fragile, her face smudged with dirt. She was out of place, a dandelion in a hothouse of orchids. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were large, dark, and filled with a solemn intensity that was far too old for her years. There was no guile in them, no hint of a cruel prank. There was only an unwavering, terrifying certainty. "What did you say?" Thomas asked, his voice a low growl of warning. He took a half-step toward her, a protective instinct warring with a cold, rising anger. "I saw her," the girl repeated, her voice steady despite her shivering. "Your wife. She's not dead." Peterson chuckled, a short, nervous sound. He stepped forward to intercept. "Let's get Mr. Beckett out of the rain. Sir, we should ignore—" "Quiet." Thomas snapped, his gaze locked on the child. The world around them seemed to recede, the mourners and their empty platitudes fading into a gray blur. The girl took a hesitant step forward, her worn sneakers squelching on the wet marble path. "I was there. The night she came out of the water, she was bleeding, scared." They dragged her into a van. A muscle in Thomas's jaw clenched so hard he felt a spike of pain. "Little girl," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but my wife drowned in a storm off the coast. The yacht was torn to pieces. There were no survivors. We searched for weeks, the Coast Guard. She survived," the girl insisted, her small chin jutting out with defiance. "I remember her. He needed to end this. It was torture, a cruel twisting of a knife that had been lodged in his soul for a year." He crossed his arms, a barrier against her words, against the insidious hope that was beginning to curl like smoke in the pit of his stomach. "And what makes you so sure it was her?" "She had a scar," the girl said, her voice clear and precise. a long one across her left arm. Right here. She traced a line on her own thin arm from the crook of her elbow down to her wrist, and her hair was short, really blonde. She kept yelling your name. "Thomas!" she screamed, over and over. Thomas's heart lurched a painful, violent jolt against his ribs. The scar. Elena had gotten that scar in college, a stupid accident involving a protest and a fall through a greenhouse window. She hated it, always tried to cover it with long sleeves, even in the summer. It was an imperfection on her otherwise flawless skin, a story she never liked to talk about. And her hair. After the chemotherapy 2 years ago, she had kept it short, a platinum blonde crop that was as sharp and defiant as her spirit. These were not details the public knew. Still, his mind fought back, clinging to the cold, hard reality of her death. He had identified pieces of the wreckage himself. He had held a funeral. He had built this memorial. He shook his head, a gesture of denial that felt weak and inadequate. "That's not possible." "Yes, it is." The girl snapped, her voice rising with frustration. They didn't let her go. A man, he was in charge. He had a fake arm like a plastic one. The world tilted slightly. A fake arm. The detail was so specific, so bizarre, it felt jarringly real. It was a piece that didn't fit into any logical puzzle, and for that very reason it snagged in his mind. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the girl, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a nuisance, but as a messenger from a world he thought had vanished. What did this man look like? White, tall, she said, her eyes unfocused as she pulled the memory from the darkness. A gray beard. He wore a long coat and he barked orders like he was in the army or something. He told the others, "Move her before anyone sees." The girl's voice began to tremble, not from cold or fear, but from the raw urgency of the memory. She saw me. Your wife. She looked right at me. Her eyes. They were full of fear, but also, it was like she knew. Like she knew I could help. Thomas blinked, the raindrops on his eyelashes blurring his vision. Or were they tears? A part of him, the rational, grieving husband, wanted to scream to command this child to stop her assault on his carefully constructed fortress of sorrow. But another part, a deeper, more primal part of him, the man who had built an empire on instinct and calculated risk, was listening. And it was terrified. She wore a necklace, the girl added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Gold, with a little heart on it. There were 2 letters on the heart, E and B. The ground fell away beneath Thomas's feet. The rain, the mourners, the marble angels, it all dissolved into a swirling vortex of disbelief. The pendant. A 10th anniversary gift he had commissioned himself, a custom design. Elena and Beckett. It had never left her neck. He had never spoken of it to the press, had never allowed photos of it to be published. Not a single soul outside their innermost circle knew of its existence. He had imagined it at the bottom of the ocean, a final secret testament to their love, lost to the crushing deep. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his mind reeling. The air felt thick, hard to draw into his lungs. He was dimly aware of Peterson trying to speak to him, of other voices murmuring, but he heard nothing but the roaring in his ears. The girl reached a small, trembling hand into the pocket of her hoodie. She pulled out a small, crumpled piece of fabric. It was a handkerchief, light blue, trimmed with delicate lace. It was soaked and frayed at the edges, stained with what could have been mud or old blood. But in the dim gray light, one word was still visible, sewn in shimmering gold thread. Elena. Thomas felt as if a physical blow had struck him. He recognized it instantly. It was from a set he'd bought her in Paris on a trip filled with laughter and stolen moments in quiet cafes. She always kept one in her purse. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Behind the old cannery," she said, her eyes holding his. "They stopped the van there that night. I watched from behind the fence. It must have fallen out when they moved her." A long, profound silence stretched between them. The wind whipped across the garden, rustling the petals on the memorial wreath he had laid just an hour ago. The world around them had vanished. There was only the man who had lost everything, the girl who had nothing, and the impossible truth that lay between them. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Maya." "And why are you telling me this now, Maya, after a whole year?" A flash of old pain crossed her face. Because no one else listened, she said the words sharp with the sting of countless dismissals. "I tried. I told a cop once. He laughed at me. He told me to stop making up stories. But it wasn't a story. I saw everything. I didn't know who you were until I saw your picture in a magazine at the library a few weeks ago. It said you would be here today." He studied her face, the fierce set of her jaw, the truth shining in her dark eyes. He saw no manipulation, no hint of deceit. He saw a child who had carried a terrible burden alone, a child who had been ignored and disbelieved until she had finally found the one person who could not afford to ignore her. Behind him, Peterson's voice became more insistent. "Sir, the reporters are starting to move in. We need to go." But Thomas didn't move. He looked from Maya's determined face to the delicate embroidered handkerchief in his palm. The golden thread seemed to catch the dim light, a tiny defiant spark in the overwhelming gray. 1,000 memories flooded him. Elena laughing on the deck of the yacht, the wind whipping through her short blonde hair. Elena tracing the scar on her arm, a wry smile on her lips. Elena whispering his name in the dark. "You're serious," he whispered, a statement, not a question. "Dead serious," she replied, the irony of her words lost on her. He made a decision. It was a choice born not of logic, but of a desperate, terrifying hope. He turned to Peterson. "Get the car." "Sir?" "Now." The black sedan, sleek and silent as a panther, rolled up the curved path. Thomas opened the rear door himself, turning to the small, drenched girl who had just shattered his world. He held out his hand. "Come with me." Maya's eyes widened, a flicker of fear and astonishment in their depths. "Really? If what you're saying is true," Thomas said, his voice low and intense, a promise forged in the fires of his reignited soul. "I need your help to bring her back." Without another word, Maya climbed into the plush leather interior of the car. Thomas slid in beside her, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid, definitive thud. The car pulled away from the memorial, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Far behind them, hidden among the ancient oaks that bordered the garden, a man in a gray raincoat lowered a pair of high-powered binoculars. He tapped a small device in his coat pocket, his expression unreadable. "They've made contact," he said into a hidden earpiece, his voice devoid of emotion. "Proceed to phase 2. Inside the car, Thomas gripped the small, damp handkerchief. The scent of rain salt and Elena's faint perfume filled his senses. For the first time in a year, he dared to believe. And that hope, wild and terrifying, scared him more than death itself. The journey from the memorial garden to the Beckett estate was a study in silence. The city bled past the tinted windows, a watercolor of gray buildings and hurried, faceless crowds. Inside the climate-controlled sanctuary of the Rolls-Royce, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Thomas sat with his back pressed against the supple leather, the damp handkerchief, a cool, heavy weight in his hand. He kept stealing glances at the girl, Maya, who sat perfectly still on the opposite seat, her small frame looking even more diminutive in the cavernous space. She did not fidget or gawp at the luxury surrounding her. She simply stared out the window, her reflection, a pale, serious ghost, superimposed over the rain-streaked cityscape. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who could dismantle a rival corporation with a single strategically placed phone call. His life was a fortress built of logic, data, and calculated risk. Yet here he was, his entire reality held hostage by the words of a homeless child. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill. He wanted to interrogate her, to pick apart her story piece by piece, until he found the flaw, the lie, the childish fantasy. But every time he looked at her eyes, he saw not deception, but the weary, unblinking honesty of someone who had witnessed too much. The iron gates of the estate, tall and imposing with the Beckett family crest forged in their center, swung open without a sound. They swept up a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient oaks, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The house appeared through the mist, not a home, but a monument of glass, steel, and stone, perched on the cliffside, its wide windows staring out at the turbulent gray ocean, like vacant eyes. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, cold, beautiful, and since Elena's departure, utterly devoid of life. The car glided to a stop under a covered portico. Before Thomas could move, the heavy front door was opened by Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose stern efficiency had been a constant in his life for 2 decades. Her expression, usually a mask of polite indifference, faltered for a fraction of a second as her gaze fell on Maya. She saw the dirty sneakers, the damp, oversized hoodie, the smudge of dirt on a pale cheek. "Mr. Beckett," she began, her voice tight with disapproval. "Shall I—" "She is with me," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped out of the car and held the door for Maya. "Her name is Maya. Find her some warm, dry clothes. And food. A hot meal immediately. Yes, sir. Mrs. Gable said, her training overriding her surprise. She cast one last uncertain look at Maya before retreating into the cavernous foyer. Maya stepped into the house, her wet shoes making a faint squeaking sound on the polished walnut floor. She stopped just inside the doorway, her head tilted back as she took in the soaring ceiling, the floating staircase that seemed to defy gravity, and the vast wall of glass that framed a furious, churning sea. The air smelled of cedar old leather and a faint lingering trace of Elena's jasmine perfume that no amount of cleaning could ever seem to erase. Thomas led her past a living area filled with minimalist furniture and abstract art into his study. It was the heart of the house, his sanctuary lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk of reclaimed wood. He gestured to a deep leather armchair by the unlit fireplace. Sit. Maya perched on the edge of the cushion, looking like a small bird ready to take flight at the slightest sound. He watched her for a moment, then turned and pressed a sequence of buttons on a discreet panel by the wall. A section of the bookshelf slid away, revealing a room beyond lined with screens and humming electronics. He stepped inside the door, sliding shut behind him, leaving Maya alone with the crackling of the digital fireplace he had just ignited. Inside his secure communications room, Thomas picked up a satellite phone. He dialed a number known to only 3 people in the world. It was answered on the first ring. Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. The voice on the other end was calm, a gravelly baritone that conveyed absolute competence. Thomas, you told me you were done with this line. I was, Thomas replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. Something has changed. I need your help. Off the books. Absolute discretion. There was a brief pause, not of hesitation, but of calculation. What's the target? A ghost. Start with Pier 14, the old cannery. I need everything you can find. Surveillance from a year ago tonight and current. I need to know who has been in and out of that building. Look for signs of containment, medical equipment, military-grade hardware. And I need you to find a man with a prosthetic left arm. White plastic, looks military. Tall gray beard. That's specific, noted, his voice unchanging. I have a witness, Thomas said, the words feeling strange and momentous on his tongue. Understood. I'll put a team on the ground within the hour. What am I walking into, Thomas? Thomas looked through the one-way glass of the communications room out into the study where Maya was now huddled under a cashmere blanket he had draped over her chair, her eyes fixed on the digital flames. I'm not sure, he said, his voice heavy with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread. I think I just stepped into the storm that was supposed to have killed my wife. He ended the call and returned to the study just as Mrs. Gable entered with a tray. On it was a bowl of steaming tomato soup, a perfectly grilled cheese sandwich cut into triangles, and a glass of milk. Maya stared at the food as if it were an alien artifact. I haven't had real food in a long time, she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the crackle of the fire. She picked up a triangle of the sandwich and took a small, careful bite, chewing slowly, deliberately. Thomas sat in the chair opposite her, a silent observer. What about your family, Maya? She didn't look up from her soup. Don't have one. School. Sometimes. When the shelters make me. Her answers were short-clipped, revealing a life spent building walls. He realized with a pang of guilt that while he had been mourning in his palace on the cliffs, this child had been surviving in the city's forgotten corners. His city, the one he supposedly ruled from his penthouse office. That same city had allowed his wife to be stolen and had rendered this child so invisible that she could witness a kidnapping without anyone ever noticing she was there. If what you saw helps me find Elena, he said, his voice softer now, I will make sure you never have to sleep near a dumpster again. I will make sure you have a home, a school, a future. I give you my word. Maya stopped eating. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the lie, the hidden angle. She had learned long ago that the promises of adults were fragile things easily broken. You don't even know me. I know you didn't have to find me, he said. You could have stayed silent. You chose not to. That's enough for me. She seemed to consider this, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay, she whispered and returned to her soup. Later that night, long after Mrs. Gable had shown Maya to a guest room, a room larger than any she had ever slept in, with a bed so soft, she felt like she was sinking into a cloud. Thomas sat in his command center. On the main screen, a satellite image of the city's industrial waterfront was displayed in stark detail. A red circle highlighted the cannery on Pier 14. His phone buzzed. It was Ree. "We're in position," Ree's voice crackled. "The place looks dead, but the perimeter security is new. The old cameras were all disconnected. Wires were cut professionally. Someone didn't want any electronic witnesses a year ago." Thomas's pulse quickened. "Anything current?" "That's the interesting part. We're picking up a faint encrypted data stream from inside. Low level, probably a remote sensor. Someone is still monitoring the building." Thomas stared at the screen at the decaying building that held the first real clue in a year. They knew. Whoever had taken Elena was still watching this place. Why were they expecting him? An hour later, another call came. Ree's voice was different this time, tight with discovery. "Thomas, you need to see this. We got into the archives of a bodega 2 blocks from the pier. Their street-facing camera. The owner deleted the footage from that week. A year ago, said the cops told him it was part of a training exercise and to wipe it. But he never wiped the backup server." And Thomas leaned forward, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. "My tech just finished restoring a fragment. The timestamp is 02:17 a.m., the night the yacht went down." An image appeared on Thomas's main screen. It was grainy, distorted by rain and darkness, but it was unmistakable. A dark panel van, no license plates, was pulling away from the alley behind the cannery. For a fraction of a second, as it passed under a street lamp, a shape was visible in the van's rear window. A flash of pale skin, a shock of short platinum blonde hair. The breath left Thomas's body in a ragged rush. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a lie. It was real. The hope he had been so afraid of erupted within him, a fierce burning thing. It consumed the grief, the despair, the year of numb emptiness, and forged it into something else. Something hard and cold and sharp. It was resolve. Elena was alive, and he was going to tear down the world to find her. The investigation was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of when. The hunt had begun. The digital clock in the command center glowed 02:47 a.m. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and studded with cold, indifferent stars. But inside Thomas Beckett, a new storm was gathering force. The grainy video clip of the unmarked van played on a silent loop on the main screen, a ghostly reenactment of the moment his world had been stolen. Each pass of the platinum blonde head in the rear window was a fresh stab of agony and a jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Hope, he was discovering, was a far more violent emotion than grief. Grief was a slow creeping rot, a passive state of decay. This new terrible hope was an active, ravenous thing. It demanded action. It demanded risk. Ree stood beside him, a solid, immovable presence in the flickering blue light of the monitors. His face etched with the memory of conflicts in places that never made. The news was a mask of professional calm. "They're still watching it," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "The sensor in the cannery is active. It's not a leftover. It's a tripwire. They want to know if anyone comes sniffing around. Then we won't give them a choice." Thomas replied, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "We're not sending a team. It's too loud, too much risk of a leak. It will be just you and me." Ree didn't argue. He simply nodded. Now. An hour later, Thomas was a different man. The bespoke suit and silk tie were gone, replaced by black tactical pants, a dark Henley, and soft-soled boots. The Billionaire CEO had been shed like a skin, and what remained was someone leaner, harder, a man who moved with a quiet, coiled energy that had long lain dormant. He met Ree at a service entrance on the far side of the estate. The trunk of Ree's unassuming black SUV was a treasure trove of deadly efficiency: encrypted communication gear, night vision goggles, entry tools, and 2 suppressed Heckler & Koch pistols. As Ree handed him a weapon, Thomas's hands accepted it with a familiarity that felt both foreign and instinctual. He checked the magazine chambered around and slipped it into a holster at the small of his back. It had been years since he'd held anything more dangerous than a fountain pen, but the weight of the steel in his hand felt like an old, grim friend. They drove in silence, leaving the pristine cliffs of the estate behind for the gritty, forgotten waterfront of the city. The cannery loomed against the night sky, a skeletal ruin silhouetted by the faint glow of the distant port. Rust bled in long streaks down its corrugated metal walls, and the wind whistled a mournful tune through its shattered windows. It looked like a place where things went to die. They parked 3 blocks away, and approached on foot, melting into the deep shadows cast by derelict warehouses and mountains of shipping containers. The air was thick with the smell of brine diesel and decay. Ree led the way, his movements fluid and economical, a ghost in the industrial graveyard. He pointed to a small, unassuming electrical box on the side of the building. The tripwire. He produced a small device from his pack, and with a few deft clicks, the sensor's signal was looped, replaying the last hour of empty silence to whoever was watching. The entry point was a rusted maintenance hatch near the foundation, its lock corroded by years of salt and neglect. It yielded to Ree's tension wrench with a low groan of tortured metal. They slipped inside into a darkness that was absolute. Their night vision goggles cast the world in an eerie phosphorescent green. The inside of the cannery was a cavernous tomb filled with the ghosts of dead machinery. Hulking silent contraptions, once the heart of a thriving industry, now sat like sleeping iron beasts draped in shrouds of dust and cobwebs. The only sound was the scuttling of unseen things, and the drip, drip, drip of water from the leaking roof, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. Thomas followed Ree, his senses on high alert. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind rattling a loose panel sent a jolt through his system. He was an intruder in his own city, a trespasser in a forgotten hell where his wife had been dragged. They moved toward the area Maya had described, the side of the building beneath a single broken light fixture. The main floor was a wasteland of debris, but Ree, scanning the layout with a practiced eye, pointed toward a section of the wall that seemed subtly different. The pattern of dust was disturbed. A newer set of hinges was barely visible beneath a coat of grime. It was a false wall. Working together in near silence, they pried it open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a narrow corridor that hadn't been on any of the building's original blueprints. The air that flowed out was different, colder, and it carried a sharp chemical scent that made Thomas's nostrils burn. Bleach. He knew that smell. It was the scent of erasure, of trying to wash away evidence of something terrible. His heart hammered against his ribs as they stepped through the opening. The corridor led to a single windowless room. The door was made of reinforced steel. Ree bypassed the electronic lock and they stepped inside. The room was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and brutally Spartan. A rusted metal cot was bolted to the floor. Thick leather restraints with heavy buckles dangled from its corners. In one corner sat a bucket. The floor was stained concrete, scrubbed clean, but not clean enough to hide the faint, darker patches. This was it. This was a cage. The abstract horror of the past year coalesced into this single, suffocating space. Elena had been here, in this cold, filthy box. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He saw her in his mind's eye, her defiant spirit trapped within these four walls. Her fiery voice reduced to screams no one would hear. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the horror until it landed on the wall beside the cot. There, at about the height of a person forced to their knees, was a series of faint scratches in the concrete. They were uneven, desperate. He moved closer, his flashlight beam illuminating the marks. E.B. Elena Beckett. He reached out a trembling hand and traced the letters. He could feel the desperation in them, the sheer force of will it must have taken for her to leave this mark. She had been fighting. She had been leaving him a sign, a final act of defiance in the face of oblivion. She had believed, even in this hell, that he would come for her. The thought broke through his rage and lanced him with a grief so sharp and pure it almost brought him to his knees. Thomas. Ree's voice was quiet, pulling him back from the edge. Over here. Ree was kneeling by the cot, his light focused on something caught on a rusted spring beneath the thin, stained mattress. It was a small scrap of fabric, navy blue silk embroidered with a silver thread. Thomas took it from him, his fingers numb. The world narrowed to the tiny piece of cloth in his palm. It was from her favorite scarf, the one he had bought her in Milan. She had been wearing it the night the yacht, her pride and joy, had been reported lost in the storm. She had laughed as she wrapped it around her neck, the silk a vibrant slash of color against her pale skin, her blonde hair catching the moonlight on the water. He remembered her smile in that moment, the easy warmth in her eyes, and he contrasted it with the cold, sterile horror of this room. The juxtaposition was so violent, so obscene, that the rage came flooding back, cold and absolute. The man who had grieved was gone. The man who had hoped was gone. In their place stood a hunter, an executioner. They didn't just take her, Thomas whispered, his voice a blade of ice. They brought her here to break her. He closed his fist around the scrap of silk. "Let's go. There's nothing more for us here." They retreated the way they came, moving back through the dead factory, their footsteps now heavy with the weight of their discovery. As they emerged from the maintenance hatch into the cool night air, the world felt different. The threat was no longer a vague suspicion. It had a face, it had a smell, it had a location. They walked briskly back toward their vehicle, staying in the shadows. As they rounded the last corner, Thomas stopped dead, pulling Ree back behind a stack of rotting pallets. "What is it?" Ree whispered. Thomas didn't answer. He pointed. Down the desolate, empty street, parked under a flickering street lamp, was a black sedan. It was too clean, too new for this part of town. The windows were tinted, but as he watched, a faint orange glow appeared and disappeared inside. The flare of a cigarette lighter. And then, for just a second, he saw the glint of light off glass, the unmistakable reflection of a pair of binoculars being raised to scan the area around the cannery. They hadn't just walked into a cold crime scene. They had tripped the wire, after all. Someone had been waiting to see if their bait was taken. The black sedan's engine purred to life without warning. It didn't speed away. It simply pulled from the curb and glided down the street, disappearing into the darkness of the city. Thomas and Ree remained frozen in the shadows, the silence pressing in on them. The enemy was no longer a faceless phantom. They were here. They were watching. The hunt for Elena had just become a war for their own survival. The first rays of dawn painted the ocean in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. Thomas stood on the terrace of his study, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his hands. He hadn't slept. Sleep felt like a surrender, a luxury he could no longer afford. The image of the black sedan gliding away into the night was burned into his mind. They were not ghosts. They were organized, patient, and they were watching his every move. The scrap of navy silk lay on the polished surface of his desk, next to a high-resolution photograph of the initials scratched into the cannery wall. Tangible proof of a nightmare made real. The hunt was no longer a one-sided affair. The prey now knew the predators were circling. Ree entered the study as the sun climbed higher, his face grim. He placed a tablet on the desk. "I ran a full analysis of the sedan, no plates as expected, but I got a partial facial recognition on the driver from a traffic cam 3 blocks away. Ex-Mossad. Currently a freelance contractor for a private security firm called Argentis. Argentis is a shell, of course. Untraceable ownership, but its primary contracts are with a logistics company named Halden Freight." Thomas's head snapped up. Halden Freight is owned by Glenn Forrester. The name tasted like acid. Glenn Forrester was a vulture in a $1,000 suit, a corporate raider who had built his empire on the bones of failed companies. He and Thomas had been rivals for years, a rivalry built on mutual contempt. But Elena had always insisted it was more than that. "He's not just a shark, Thomas," she had told him once, her eyes dark with a conviction he had dismissed at the time as paranoia. "He's a monster hiding in plain sight. His ships don't just carry cargo." Elena was investigating him before the accident. Thomas said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. She was building a case against Halden Freight, trying to prove they were a front for something much worse. "It seems she was right," Ree said. "Forrester is our first thread. We pull it, the whole tapestry might unravel." Thomas's decision was instant. "Set up a meeting. I want to see him, today." The meeting took place not in an office, but in the hushed, opulent dining room of the Pinnacle Club, a place where deals worth billions were made over aged scotch and rare steak. It was Glenn's territory, a place where he felt powerful, untouchable. Thomas intended to shatter that illusion. Glenn Forrester was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His suit was impeccable, his watch worth more than most houses, and his smile was a predatory slash. "Thomas," he began, extending a manicured hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure I thought you were still in mourning?" Thomas ignored the offered hand and sat down, his gaze as cold and hard as a glacier. "We need to talk about your cargo, Glenn." Glenn's smile faltered for a second. "My cargo, I move millions of tons of it a year. You'll have to be more specific. Let's talk about a specific shipment from 1 year ago." Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The kind that doesn't show up on any manifest. The kind that requires a discreet security team, maybe even a man with a distinctive prosthetic arm." The color drained from Glenn's face. He picked up his water glass, but his hand trembled slightly, betraying the panic in his eyes. I have no idea what you're talking about. You're not making any sense. I make perfect sense. Thomas continued, leaning forward slightly. I'm talking about a woman with short platinum blonde hair. I'm talking about a holding cell in an abandoned cannery. I'm talking about my wife. Glenn flinched as if struck. Your wife is dead, Thomas. It was a tragedy. Everyone knows that. She isn't dead, Thomas said, letting the words hang in the air between them. And you know it. You were part of it. You're a coward, Glenn, a bottom feeder who got in over his head. Now you're going to tell me who you work for. I work for myself. Glenn stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. No, you don't, Thomas countered. Men like you are never at the top of the food chain. You're a tool. A well-paid one, I'm sure, but a tool nonetheless. So you have a choice. You can tell me who is pulling your strings, or I can personally dedicate the full weight of my fortune to dismantling your life piece by piece. I will ruin your company, your reputation, and your family. I will not stop until you are begging for a bankruptcy you will never get. The threat was not an exaggeration, and they both knew it. Glenn stared at him, his face a mask of terror. He was trapped between the devil he knew and the devil sitting right in front of him. You don't understand, Glenn whispered, his voice cracking. You can't fight them. Nobody can. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. It's the triangle. He shook his head, looking around the restaurant nervously. I've said too much. I can't. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his water glass. Stay away from me, Thomas. For your own good. Just let her go. He turned and practically fled from the dining room, leaving Thomas alone at the table, a single chilling word echoing in his mind. Triangle. That evening, Rhee stood before the main screen in the command center. He had cross-referenced Glenn's known associates, his financial records, and every piece of data they had on Halden Freight with the word triangle. The result was a web of connections that was as intricate as it was terrifying. It's called the Black Triangle, Rhee explained, his face grim. It's less of a company and more of a shadow syndicate. They operate on a global scale. Corporate espionage, political assassinations, human trafficking. They're guns for hire for corporations and corrupt governments who need problems to disappear quietly. They're ghosts. Officially, they don't exist. He brought up a new file. It was Elena's. A secret encrypted folder he had recovered from a backup of her personal server. On the screen were shipping routes, bank codes, and names, all connected by a web of arrows pointing to one symbol, a simple, solid black triangle. My God, Thomas whispered. She was going to expose the entire network. He looked at the files, at the meticulous, dangerous work his wife had been doing in secret. The kidnapping wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about silencing her before she could bring their world crashing down. He felt a new wave of guilt wash over him. He had been so absorbed in his own world, his own deals, that he had missed the signs. He had failed to see the danger she was in. He had failed to protect her. A soft knock came at the study door. Maya stood there, her face pale. There was someone in my room, she said, her voice trembling. Thomas and Rhee exchanged a look of alarm and were moving before she finished her sentence. They found her guest room exactly as she had left it. The bed neatly made, the new clothes folded on a chair. What did you see? Thomas asked gently. I didn't see anything, she said, pointing to the window. I felt it. The window was locked when I went for dinner. Now it's not. Rhee inspected the latch. No signs of forced entry. They used a bypass tool. Professional. His gaze swept the room. They weren't looking for anything. They were sending a message that they can get to her whenever they want. The violation was profound. They had breached his fortress. They had threatened a child under his protection. The last vestiges of his adherence to any rules of engagement evaporated. He led Maya back to the study, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He would not fail again. He strode into the command center, Rhee following close behind. They want a war, Thomas said, his voice ringing with cold fury. They're going to get one. He stood before the global map on the screen, a general surveying his new battlefield. He was done reacting. He was done being a step behind. From now on, he would be the one setting the traps. Rhee, he commanded, his voice sharp and clear. Liquidate the assets in the Cayman accounts. All of them. I want a disposable fund of at least $200 million by morning. Start recruiting. I want the best freelance intelligence analysts, The best wet work operatives you can find. No questions asked, top dollar. I want a ghost team loyal only to me. And find us a new base of operations. Something secure, something off-grid. The estate is compromised. He turned his eyes blazing with a fire that would have terrified his corporate rivals. Glenn Forrester was a thread. The Black Triangle is the monster. We are no longer looking for my wife. We are going to hunt down this entire network and we are going to burn it to the ground. Maya stood in the doorway listening. The fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. Awe. Determination. She had spent her life being invisible, but now she was standing in the heart of a secret war allied with a man who was about to unleash a storm upon the world. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a soldier. The 3 weeks that followed were a blur of calculated chaos. The Beckett estate, once a symbol of quiet opulence, transformed into the clandestine headquarters of a private war. The ghost team Thomas had ordered began to materialize, flown in from shadowed corners of the globe. There was Anya, a former MI6 analyst with eyes that saw patterns in random data, the way an artist sees a sculpture in a block of marble. Beside her was Kyle, a prodigy hacker barely out of his teens, whose fingers danced across keyboards like a concert pianist, dismantling firewalls and bypassing encryptions with terrifying ease. They, along with Rhee's hand-picked team of 4 hardened field operatives, became the core of Thomas's new army. Their base of operations was a decommissioned corporate data bunker Thomas had built years ago beneath the estate's west wing, a sterile, climate-controlled labyrinth of servers and monitors that was now the nerve center of their hunt for the Black Triangle. For Maya, this new reality was both terrifying and intoxicating. She became a fixture in the command center, a small, quiet shadow observing the whirlwind of activity. The fear from the break-in had not disappeared, but it had been reforged into a sharp, watchful focus. She absorbed everything. Anya taught her basic tradecraft how to spot a tail, how to create a dead drop. Kale, recognizing a kindred analytical mind, showed her how to trace digital footprints and navigate the deep web's murky currents. She was no longer just a witness. She was becoming an asset, a student in a school of shadows. A strange, unspoken bond formed between her and Thomas. He was no longer just a distant, powerful benefactor. He was a commander, and in his moments of quiet reflection, she saw the weary father figure beneath the general's armor. He made sure she ate, that she slept, that she had books to read that had nothing to do with surveillance or ballistics. In turn, she became a silent anchor for him, a living reminder of the stakes of the innocence he was fighting to protect, and in some way to reclaim for himself. Then the message came. It arrived not through a conventional channel, but as a ghost in the machine, a single encrypted data packet that bypassed their outer security layers before Kale's algorithms caught and isolated it. It was a whisper from the void, untraceable, anonymous. They're holding her at the old shipyard warehouse 7. Anya read from her screen, her voice tight. Intel suggests a transfer is scheduled for tomorrow night, 0300. Light security, a 4-man team. They're getting complacent. The message included a detailed schematic of the warehouse and a list of guard patrol timings. It was perfect, too perfect. It's a trap, Rhee said flatly, his arms crossed as he stared at the screen. They're baiting us. They showed us they can get into the house. Now they send us a gilded invitation to a firefight. They want to draw us out onto their turf. Thomas stared at the schematic, his mind a whirlwind of calculation. He knew Rhee was right. Every instinct honed by years of hostile takeovers and corporate backstabbing screamed that this was a gambit. But the sliver of a chance, however small that Elena might actually be, there was a lure he could not ignore. The alternative was to wait to let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement, and that was a strategy Thomas had never accepted in his life. I know it's a trap, he said, turning to face his team. But we're not going to avoid it. We're going to spring it. He looked at Rhee. They expect a frontal assault. They expect us to be predictable. We won't be. They want to play chess fine, but we're not playing to a draw. We're playing to burn the board. For the next 24 hours they planned. They did not plan a rescue. They planned a counter-ambush. The night of the operation was cold and moonless. The shipyard was a sprawling necropolis of rusting cranes and skeletal gantries, a place where ships came to be dismantled and forgotten. Thomas's team moved in 2 units. He, Rhee, and 2 operatives would form the entry team, the bait. Anya, Kale, and the rest of the team were positioned a mile away in a mobile communications van, their eyes and ears. As they approached Warehouse 7, a vast corrugated steel box bleeding rust into the damp air, Thomas felt a familiar coldness settle over him. It was the same feeling he got before a hostile merger, a chilling clarity where emotion was stripped away, leaving only the sharp, clean lines of strategy. He wore a lightweight tactical vest under a dark jacket, the weight of the pistol at his back, a solid, reassuring pressure. He had insisted on being on the entry team. This was his fight, and he would not lead it from behind a screen. They bypassed the main doors, entering through a high ventilation shaft as the intel had suggested. Inside the warehouse was a cavern of shadows filled with towering stacks of shipping containers. The air was still and smelled of stagnant water and cold metal. It was as the intel had promised, eerily quiet. Too quiet. They moved in a diamond formation, their suppressed weapons at the ready, clearing corners, with silent, practiced efficiency. The place was a ghost town. The guard patrols listed in the intel were non-existent. The deeper they moved into the warehouse, the more the tension coiled in Thomas's gut. This was not a place where prisoners were held. This was a stage, a killing floor. They reached the center of the vast open space. It was completely empty. In the very middle of the concrete floor, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the high ceiling, sat a small metal folding chair. On the seat of the chair was a satellite phone, and it was ringing. The sound was obscene in the profound silence, a shrill, insistent summons to their own execution. Reese swore under his breath, his weapon sweeping the high catwalks and shadowed corners. Thomas don't. But Thomas was already walking forward, his steps echoing in the cavernous space. He knew it was a trigger, a final move in his opponent's game. But he had to know who was on the other end. He had to hear the voice of the devil who had taken his wife. He reached the chair and picked up the phone. He pressed the button. "Hello, Thomas," a voice said. It was a digital monstrosity, synthesized and cold-stripped of all humanity. It was the voice of a machine or a god, or both. "I knew you would come. Predictability is your weakness. You let hope cloud your judgment." "Who is this?" Thomas growled. "A question you are not yet worthy of asking," the voice replied. It was calm, condescending, utterly in control. "I wanted to deliver a message. You are a businessman playing at war. You move money. I move lives. You cannot win. Your new analyst, Anya, is quite skilled, as is the boy Kale, and the girl, Maya. She has so much spirit. It would be a shame to see it extinguished." The mention of Maya sent a spear of ice through Thomas's heart. They had a leak, or their surveillance was impossibly deep. "This is your only warning," the voice continued. "Disband your little army. Go back to your empty house and your empty life. Mourn your wife. If you do not, the next time we meet, it will not be in an empty building. The consequences will be personal." The line went dead. In the ensuing silence, Thomas heard a new sound, a faint, high-pitched beep. Kale's voice screamed in his earpiece. "The phone is the trigger. It's on a dead man's switch." He hung up. "Get out. The whole warehouse is wired." There was no time to think, only to run. Go now," Ree roared, shoving Thomas toward the way they came. The world erupted. The first explosion came from the far side of the warehouse, a deafening concussion that blew a shipping container off its stack like a child's toy. Then a chain reaction of blasts tore through the building, fireballs blooming in the darkness, steel girders twisting and screaming as they were ripped from the ceiling. The floor buckled beneath them. Shrapnel whizzed past Thomas's head, hot and sharp. The air was sucked from his lungs, replaced by a thick, choking cloud of smoke and concrete dust. He was thrown forward by the force of a nearby blast, his shoulder slamming into a concrete pillar. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up his arm. Ree grabbed him by the vest, hauling him to his feet, dragging him toward the gaping hole in the wall where a loading bay door used to be. They stumbled out into the cold night air, the roar of the collapsing warehouse behind them, a physical blow. They dove behind a concrete barrier as the entire structure imploded, sending a tidal wave of fire and debris into the sky. For a long moment they lay there, gasping for air, their ears ringing the heat of the fire scorching their faces. They were alive, battered, bruised, but alive. Back in the communications van, Anya and Kale watched the thermal imaging from a drone as the warehouse became a funeral pyre. Maya stood behind them, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of a chair, her eyes wide with horror. She had heard everything over the comms, the taunting voice, the warning, the explosion. An hour later, in the sterile quiet of the underground bunker, the team regrouped. The two operatives were wounded, but not critically. Thomas's shoulder was dislocated and Ree was tending to it with a grim efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. The mood was somber, shaken. The trap had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a brutal demonstration of the Black Triangle's power. They had been thoroughly, humiliatingly outplayed. Thomas stood up, his face pale with pain and exhaustion, his arm in a makeshift sling. He looked at the faces of his team, at their fear, their doubt. He saw Maya watching him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. He walked to the main screen, which now showed a live newsfeed of helicopters circling the burning shipyard. "They wanted to scare us," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of tempered steel. "They wanted to show us that they are untouchable, that they control the game. They wanted us to run." He turned to face them, and in his eyes there was no fear. There was only a terrifying cold clarity. "They're wrong. They didn't teach us to be afraid. They just taught us how to fight. They think they know the rules of this game." A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "From now on, there are no rules." In the week following the explosion, the atmosphere in the bunker shifted from one of reactive defense to predatory stillness. The attack had been a brutal lesson, and Thomas had learned it well. The remnants of the grieving husband were burned away in the fires of Warehouse 7, leaving behind the cold, hard calculus of a commander. His dislocated shoulder was now bound in a tight sling, a constant throbbing reminder of their enemy's lethality and his own vulnerability. The mantra, "no rules," became their silent creed. He pushed his team and himself relentlessly. Days blurred into nights as they worked, fueled by caffeine and a cold, shared fury. Anya's screens were a dizzying tapestry of financial networks and satellite imagery, while Kyle waged his own silent war in the digital trenches, building layers of counter-surveillance so thick that their bunker effectively vanished from the global grid. Maya, now an integral part of their inner circle, tracked dark web chatter, her young eyes learning to pick out whispers of Black Triangle activity from the endless noise. She was building her own set of walls, not of fear, but of knowledge. It was Kale who found the anomaly. A single, impossibly sophisticated encrypted file sent from a dead-end server in Estonia, addressed to no one and everyone. It had floated in the deep web for 3 days, a digital message in a bottle. "It's a ghost packet," Kale announced, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "Designed to degrade after a single viewing. Whoever sent this is either brilliant or suicidal." Ree stood behind him, arms crossed. "Or they're trying to lure us into another trap. Open it in a quarantined sandbox. I want to see what's inside." The file decrypted into a simple text-only message: "I know what you are looking for. I was part of the Triangle. I want out. Prove you are not them, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom. The architect of your pain is named Hale." The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Hale. It was the first time their faceless enemy had been given a name. "It's bait," Anya said immediately. "They know we're hunting for a name. This is too easy." Maybe Thomas said, his gaze fixed on the screen. Or maybe it's a crack in their wall, a defector. Every empire has them. He turned to Kale. "Can you talk to him without revealing our position?" "I can try," Kale said, a thrill of challenge in his eyes. "It'll be like playing chess in the dark on a moving train." What followed was a tense 24-hour digital duel. Kale created a secure anonymous chat link, and the mysterious contact responded. The sender, who identified himself only as Julian, refused to give any personal information. Instead, he proposed a test of faith. He would provide one piece of high-value intelligence. If Thomas and his team could verify it, it would prove their capabilities and his legitimacy. "Ask him for the real name of the man with the prosthetic arm," Thomas instructed. The reply came back in minutes. "Gideon Price, ex-Special Air Service, dishonorably discharged, specialist in wet work and enhanced interrogation." He was Hale's right hand. The message also included a bank account number in Zurich. Ree and Anya went to work. Within an hour, they had confirmation. Gideon Price was a ghost in every official database, but in the mercenary underworld, his name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. The Zurich account, which Anya's programs sliced through with surgical precision, was a slush fund tied directly to a shell corporation owned by Glenn Forrester. "He's real," Ree said, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "The intel is solid." Thomas gave the order. "Bring him in." Bringing Julian in was a nerve-wracking affair involving a dead drop in a Viennese cafe, a private jet with a falsified flight plan, and a final tense meeting in a secure location in the Swiss Alps. Julian Price was not what they expected. He was young, bookish, with nervous energy and the haunted eyes of a man who had seen too much. He was a data analyst, a digital architect, who had helped build the very systems Black Triangle used to operate. I didn't know what it was. At first, Julian explained, his voice low as he sat across from Thomas in the sterile safe house. I was recruited out of university. They told me I was building logistical software for global shipping, secure, efficient, next-generation stuff. And I was. But the cargo wasn't always what it seemed. He explained that he had stumbled upon a hidden subledger, a set of manifests that detailed a different kind of shipment, human beings. When he had tried to raise questions, his access was restricted, and his supervisor had given him a friendly warning about the dangers of curiosity. That was when he started digging on his own, creating a secret backdoor into the system he had helped design. They're not just traffickers or mercenaries, Julian said, his hands trembling slightly as he opened his encrypted laptop. They are information brokers. They deal in secrets, in leverage. They move people, yes, but they also move data that can topple governments or sink corporations. They are a private for-profit intelligence agency with no flag and no morality. Then he brought up a new file, and Thomas's world narrowed to the image on the screen. It was an organizational chart, a web of names and shell corporations. And at the very center, like a spider in its web, was the name Hale. I've never met him, Julian said. No one has, except for his inner circle. He's a ghost, a legend. They say he was one of the CIA's top strategists during the Cold War. A man who believed that history is a chaotic storm that must be controlled not by governments, but by a steady, unseen hand. His hand. He doesn't believe in good or evil, only in order and chaos. And he is the self-appointed arbiter. This was a villain more terrifying than a simple crime lord. This was a man driven by a philosophy, a zealot with the resources of a small nation. Elena found out, Thomas said, the realization dawning. She was connecting the trafficking to the data brokerage. She was about to expose not just a crime, but a global conspiracy. Julian nodded grimly. They couldn't afford to let that happen. Hale considers exposure a form of chaos, and he eliminates it without prejudice. He clicked another file. And your wife. She wasn't his only problem. A new face appeared on the screen. A woman with intense, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Leora Bentley, Julian said. An investigative journalist. She was on the same trail as your wife, but from a different angle. She was tracking a string of disappearances of political dissidents in Central America and followed the trail to a Black Triangle shipping route. They took her 6 months before they took your wife. She was made to disappear during a supposed hiking accident in Costa Rica. The mission, which had been a laser-focused quest for Elena, suddenly fractured its scope, widening to an almost impossible degree. He was now responsible for other lives for a journalist who had been erased for daring to tell the truth. He looked at the picture of Leora Bentley, at the defiance in her eyes, and he saw a reflection of Elena's own spirit. He knew with absolute certainty what Elena would want him to do, what she would demand he do. The personal vendetta was no longer enough. This had to be about justice. Where are they? Thomas asked, his voice low and steady. Where does Hale keep the people he can't afford to kill, but can't allow to be free? Julian took a deep breath. That's the crown jewel. Their deniability depends on their captives never being found. They're held in a place that officially doesn't exist. A black site. I was never meant to see the data, but I found a fragment in a system diagnostic log. A set of geo-coordinates that corresponded with massive encrypted energy and supply shipments. He worked with Cale for the next hour, the two hackers communicating in a rapid-fire language of code and data streams. Finally, Cale leaned back from his keyboard, his face pale. He's right, Cale said, turning his screen for everyone to see. On it was a satellite image of a vast empty stretch of the Gulf of Mexico. And in the middle of that blue emptiness was a single dark speck. As Kyle zoomed in, the speck resolved into the shape of a massive aging structure, an industrial relic from another era. It's the Cerberus platform, Ree said, recognizing it instantly. A deep-sea oil rig decommissioned 15 years ago. It's a ghost on the maps. No one has been out there in over a decade. Not no one. Thomas corrected, his eyes fixed on the image of the isolated steel island. It was a modern-day Alcatraz, a fortress surrounded by 1,000 miles of unforgiving ocean. A perfect place to hide secrets. A perfect place to make people disappear forever. Thomas stood up and looked at his team. The doubt and fear from the warehouse explosion were gone, replaced by a singular sharp-edged purpose. "Gear up," he said. "We're going to pay Mr. Hale a visit." The impossible rescue was on. The Gulf of Mexico was a vast, black mirror under a starless sky. A low-slung, decommissioned fishing trawler named the Wanderer cut through the choppy water, its engines muffled to a low thrum. On its deck, Thomas and his team made their final preparations in the eerie green glow of their equipment. The salt spray was a constant mist on their faces, cold and sharp. In the distance, a flicker of light impossibly remote marked their destination. The Cerberus platform. Julian's intel had been brutally specific. The rig was a self-contained fortress. Sonar nets patrolled the depths below, a wideband radar system swept the skies above, and thermal cameras monitored every inch of its rusting superstructure. A direct aerial or surface assault was suicide. Their method of approach was therefore one of silent audacity. 3 miles from the target, the trawler cut its engines, drifting on the dark swell. From its belly, a small matte black submersible was deployed. Crammed inside were Thomas Rhee and 2 of his best operatives, Kai and Marcus. They were encased in a bubble of recycled air and cold tension, the only sounds the soft hum of the electric motor and the ping of their navigation system. Through the forward viewport, the rig began to resolve from a distant shadow into a metal leviathan. It rose from the sea on colossal weed-encrusted legs, a skeletal monster of rust and steel, its derrick a jagged claw scraping at the dark sky. It was a place outside the world, a monument to forgotten industry repurposed into a modern-day dungeon. "We're approaching the rendezvous point." Rhee's voice crackled in their headsets, calm and steady. "Kill the motor." The submersible went silent, drifting the final 100 yards on momentum alone, sliding beneath the rig's massive underbelly, a place untouched by the sweeping radar. Above them, a designated entry hatch, a maintenance port for the platform's primary seawater pumps, was their only way in. Kai, a former Navy SEAL with a penchant for underwater demolitions, exited the submersible first, a wraith in the inky water. He ascended the colossal leg of the rig magnetic clamps, securing his progress until he reached the hatch. The wait was agonizing. Thomas watched the seconds tick by on his chronometer, each one an eternity. The lives of everyone he cared about hinged on the silence of the next few moments. Finally, Kai's voice came through a clipped whisper. "Hatch is open. I'm in. Path is clear." One by one, they ascended, climbing a service ladder into the guts of the machine. They emerged into a cramped, humid pump room, the air thick with the smell of ozone and old oil. The thrum of massive machinery vibrated through the grated floor, a constant, oppressive heartbeat. The gauntlet had begun. For the first hour, they moved in absolute silence, ghosts in the machine. They ascended through levels of catwalks and corridors, a vertical maze of pipes and conduits. Rhee led the way, his movements a symphony of deadly grace. They neutralized 3 guards on patrol lone sentinels, swallowed by the shadows, before they could even register the threat. Each takedown was silent, brutal, and efficient. They reached the habitation levels and the atmosphere changed. The raw industrial feel gave way to sterile, prefabricated corridors, lit by cold, humming fluorescent lights. Here, there were more guards, mercenaries armed with state-of-the-art assault rifles, their movements professional and alert. A silent approach was no longer an option. The first firefight erupted in a narrow corridor outside the mess hall. A 2-man patrol turned a corner unexpectedly, and the world exploded into chaos. The suppressed pops of Rhee's and Kai's weapons were answered by the deafening roar of automatic fire. Bullets sparked off the metal walls, ricocheting with angry whines. Thomas dropped behind a support pillar, his own pistol barking in his hands. He was not a soldier like Rhee, but years of crisis had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He fired twice, and one of the mercenaries crumpled to the ground. The alarm blared, a jarring, whooping cry that echoed through the entire structure. Stealth was shattered. Now it was a race against time. "Kale, we're loud!" Rhee barked into his comms. "Where is the detention block?" Kale's voice, calm and disembodied, came back instantly from the command van miles away. 2 levels up. Sector Gamma. He's rerouting the elevator controls now. Get to Shaft C. They fought their way forward, a blur of coordinated violence. Marcus laid down suppressing fire while Kai leapfrogged to the next junction. Thomas and Ree covered the rear, a deadly tandem of strategy and force. The mercenaries were good, but they were defending. Thomas's team was attacking with the righteous fury of liberators. They reached the elevator shaft just as the heavy doors hissed open, Kale's digital ghost having seized control of the rig's nervous system. They piled in the doors, closing on a scene of smoke and expended shell casings. The detention block was a place of cold, clinical horror. A long white corridor was lined with cells, not with bars, but with thick, reinforced polycarbonate doors. Inside each, a lone figure. Thomas's eyes scanned the cells, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. And then he saw her. She was in the third cell on the left. Her platinum blonde hair was dull and matted, her face gaunt and pale, a landscape of bruises and exhaustion. She was painfully thin, a mere specter of the vibrant woman he remembered. She sat on a narrow cot, her back to the door, but as if sensing his presence, she slowly turned her head. Her eyes, those fierce, intelligent eyes, met his. They were sunken, haunted, but in their depths, a flicker of the old fire ignited. A universe of pain, love, and disbelief passed between them in that silent, frozen moment. "Elena," he breathed, his voice catching. Ree and his team were already at work planting a shaped charge on the cell's electronic lock. "Get back," Ree yelled. The explosion was a sharp crack, and the door hissed open. Thomas rushed inside, falling to his knees beside her cot. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a second before gently touching her face, as if to confirm she was real, that she wasn't another ghost of his grief. Her hand, thin and cold, came up to cover his. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Always," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. He helped her to her feet. She was weak, unsteady, but she stood. He pulled a pistol from his own holster and pressed it into her hand. "Can you use this?" A ghost of her old defiant smile touched her lips. "Try and stop me." "We've got company," Kai yelled from the corridor. They worked fast, blowing the locks on the other cells. A gaunt but fierce-looking woman with cropped hair and burning eyes stumbled out. "Leora Bentley?" Thomas asked. She nodded, taking the rifle Ree offered her without a word. Two other men, political prisoners from the look of them, followed, bewildered but ready to fight. Their escape was a running battle back the way they came. Elena, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, moved with a surprising strength, fighting beside Thomas, as if they had done this 100 times before. Leora was a demon, her journalistic fury channeled into a cold, precise rage. They reached the top deck, the helipad spilling out into the whipping, salt-laden wind. The sky was beginning to bleed with the first light of dawn. Their extraction helicopter was descending, a dark angel coming to lift them from hell. But their path was blocked. He stood before them, a silhouette against the rising sun. Gideon Price. His prosthetic arm gleamed, and in his other hand he held a large-caliber revolver. Behind him, the last of his mercenaries took up defensive positions. "This is as far as you go, Beckett." Gideon sneered, his voice a low growl. "Hale sends his regards." "I'll deliver my response in person," Thomas retorted, shoving Elena behind him. The helipad erupted into a final, desperate firefight. Thomas and the others provided covering fire as Ree moved forward to confront his opposite number. It was a primal, brutal dance. Ree, all fluid motion and precise strikes. Gideon, a monolith of brute force, his prosthetic arm a deadly bludgeon and shield. The fight was a whirlwind of motion, the crack of bone against metal, the grunts of exertion lost in the roar of the helicopter and the storm of gunfire. Ree was faster. He ducked under a vicious swing from the prosthetic arm, driving the butt of his rifle into Gideon's knee. As the larger man staggered, Ree disarmed him with a single brutal twist, sending the revolver skittering across the deck. The fight ended with a sickening crunch as Ree brought his heel down on Gideon's collarbone. The giant crumpled to the deck, a broken wreck. "Let's go," Thomas yelled, pulling his team toward the waiting chopper. They scrambled aboard, hauling the exhausted prisoners with them. As the helicopter lifted off the deck, gaining altitude over the dark, churning sea, Ree pulled a small remote detonator from his vest. "For Elena," he said, and pressed the button. The Cerberus platform died in a chain reaction of fire. The explosives they had planted in the rig's core ignited, turning the metal fortress into a volcano. A massive fireball billowed into the dawn sky, and with a groan that seemed to shake the very ocean, the rig buckled, broke apart, and slid beneath the waves, taking its dark secrets to the abyss. They flew east into the sunrise, leaving a pillar of black smoke to mark their victory. Thomas held Elena's hand, her head resting on his shoulder, the first rays of a new day warming their faces. They had won. They had walked through hell and emerged into the light. But he knew with a chilling certainty that the war was far from over. They had merely killed one of the Hydra's heads. The sterile quiet of the private medical wing was a world away from the fire and chaos of the oil rig. The facility, nestled in a secluded Swiss valley and owned by a discreet Beckett subsidiary, was a sanctuary of hushed efficiency. Here the survivors of the Cerberus platform began the slow process of healing their physical and psychological wounds, tended to with meticulous care. Thomas rarely left Elena's side. He watched as the color slowly returned to her face, as the haunted, distant look in her eyes was gradually replaced by the familiar, sharp intelligence he loved. The trauma had taken its toll, leaving her thinner, her movements more deliberate, but it had failed to extinguish the fire within her. If anything, her captivity had tempered her spirit into something harder, more brilliant. They didn't speak much of what had happened. Not yet. There was no need. Their reunion was a quiet language of shared moments. The way he would adjust her pillow without being asked, the way her hand would find his in the middle of the night. They were two halves of a whole broken apart, and now against all odds pieced back together. Their bond, forged in love and luxury, had been tested in the abyss and emerged unbreakable. On the third day, Elena sat up in her bed, her gaze clear and resolute. "Call a meeting," she said, her voice still raspy but firm. Leora, Julian, it's time we talked." They gathered in a secure conference room adjacent to the medical wing. It was a council of war, a strange assembly of survivors and soldiers. Leora Bentley, though still gaunt, had a crusading zeal in her eyes. Julian Price, the defector, seemed to have shed his nervous energy, his guilt now channeled into a focused determination. And Reese stood by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. Maya sat beside Thomas, a notebook and pen in her hands, her presence a quiet testament to how this all began. She was no longer just a witness. She was a chronicler of their rebellion. Elena began, her voice gaining strength with every word. She painted a chilling, detailed picture of the Black Triangle, not from the outside looking in, but from within its dark heart. "They are not a simple criminal enterprise," she explained, her eyes moving from face to face. "They are a corporation of chaos. Halden Freight is just one of dozens of legitimate companies they use as a facade. Shipping tech, private security, even humanitarian aid organizations. They use these as cover to move their real assets, people, weapons, and data." She described the trafficking the way they would absorb refugees from war-torn regions or lure skilled workers with false contracts, turning them into a disposable, untraceable labor force. But that, she insisted, was only a means to an end. "Their true currency is leverage," Elena said. "They gather secrets. They learn the weaknesses of powerful people, politicians, CEOs, generals. Then they use that leverage to manipulate markets, to influence elections, to start and end conflicts. They don't serve any nation or ideology. They serve the principle of control. And at the center of it all is Hale." Thomas added, his voice low. Elena's expression hardened. "I saw him once. They brought me to him for an interrogation. He's not what you'd expect. He's quiet, academic. He wears tailored suits and speaks like a university professor. But his eyes are the coldest things I've ever seen." She recounted the conversation, her voice dropping as she channeled the memory. "He told me I was a sentimentalist. He said the world is a rabid dog and that governments with their laws and their ethics are just children trying to pet it. He believes he is the only one with the courage to put a leash on it. He told me he doesn't create chaos, he simply manages it. He sees himself as a shepherd, and the rest of humanity is just a flock to be culled and controlled for the greater good." A heavy silence filled the room. This was a villain far more dangerous than a man motivated by greed. This was a true believer, a fallen philosopher king who had appointed himself the world's secret master. Leora spoke next, her voice raw with anger. "She's right. I was investigating a series of political assassinations in Central America that were being blamed on cartels. But the logistics, the precision, it wasn't the cartels. It was them. They were destabilizing the region to install a puppet government that would give them control of a new deep-water port. I got too close, and they erased me." Julian added his piece of the puzzle, bringing up network charts on the room's main screen. "What Elena and Leora are describing is the operational level, but the entire structure is supported by a financial network of unimaginable complexity. They launder billions through cryptocurrency offshore banks and the art market. They are so deeply embedded in the global financial system that to cut them out would be like performing surgery on the world's economy with a chainsaw. Thomas looked at the faces around the table. He saw the trauma, the exhaustion, the burning desire for justice. He thought of the life he had lost, the year of suffocating grief. He had gotten Elena back, but the world she had been stolen from was gone forever. They could take his money, his name, and disappear. They could try to build a new life on some remote island, forever looking over their shoulders. But he knew it would be a fool's errand. Hale was not a man who left loose ends. His twisted philosophy would not allow for witnesses to his world order to simply walk away. They would be hunted, and eventually, they would be found. The freedom they had won on the oil rig was nothing but a temporary reprieve. "We can't run," Thomas said, voicing the grim conclusion that had settled in everyone's heart. "There's no place on Earth he can't reach. Hiding is just a slower way to die. So we fight," Rhee said. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. "We don't just fight him, we expose him. We turn his own weapon information against him. We can't just cut off the heads of the Hydra. We have to burn the whole creature in the light of day so that everyone can see it for what it is." The mission was no longer a personal quest. It had become a crusade. The objective was no longer rescue. It was revolution. The energy in the room shifted, coalescing into a singular, unwavering purpose. They were no longer victims. They were insurgents. Julian Cale Thomas began, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a CEO launching his most ambitious venture. "I want you to weaponize every piece of data we have. Everything from Elena, from Leora, from your own archives. Create a single undeniable dossier. I want it ready for a global simultaneous release." He turned to Elena and Leora. "You two will craft the narrative. You will prepare statements, interviews. You will contact the few journalists in the world we can trust. When this information drops, you will be the voices that guide the world's understanding of it. You will give the victims a face." Finally, he looked at Rhee. "You and your team will find Hale's command center. The brain. We know his prison, but we don't know his sanctuary. Find it. We're going to hit him where he lives. We will physically sever his control over his network at the exact moment his empire is exposed to the world." It was an impossible plan, a mad gamble against a ghost who controlled a shadow empire. They were a handful of broken people against a global conspiracy. But as Thomas looked at the faces in the room, the soldier, the journalists, the hacker, the child who had started it all, and the woman he loved, he felt not fear but a profound and liberating certainty. He was a man who built things, and now he was going to build a war. Maya, who had been sketching furiously in her notebook, looked up. She slid the notebook across the table. On the page was not a face or a memory, but a symbol. A solid black triangle with a crack of brilliant light splitting it in two. Beneath it she had written a single word: enough. The world did not change overnight. Empires, even shadow ones, do not crumble into dust with a single blow. They fracture, splinter, and their toxic remnants seep into the cracks of the world. But the fall of the Black Triangle was not a whisper. It was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of power across the globe. In the 6 months that followed the raid on Hale's data fortress and the subsequent global broadcast of his entire criminal enterprise, a slow, painful, but undeniable reckoning began. The data dump, which journalists had dubbed the Hale Confessionals, was a relentless poison in the veins of the corrupt. A Japanese tech mogul implicated in funding the trafficking ring took his own life in his penthouse in Tokyo. A French cabinet minister resigned in disgrace after his encrypted communications with Hale were laid bare. Dozens of arrests were made, from Shell Corporation CEOs in Delaware to mercenary recruiters in South Africa. Hale himself was now a ghost of a different sort. Captured during the raid, he was held in an undisclosed maximum security facility, a man without a country, his name a byword for a new form of ideological terror. His empire was broken, his network shattered, his name forever stained. The world, bruised and reeling, had been forced to look into the abyss, and it could not unsee what it had found there. For Thomas, Elena, and Maya, the aftermath was a quiet dawn after a long and brutal night. The Beckett estate, once a military command center, slowly transformed back into a home. The armored SUVs were replaced by garden trucks. The hum of servers in the underground bunker was silenced, the screens dark. The scars on the building were repaired, the scorched walls repainted, but the memory of the battle remained a silent testament to the war they had waged and won. Their lives found a new rhythm, one built not on survival, but on healing. There were quiet dinners on the terrace, the setting sun casting a warm glow on their faces. There were long walks along the cliffside paths, the roar of the ocean no longer a reminder of loss, but a promise of permanence. They were a strange, unlikely family, forged not by blood, but by fire, and a shared unwavering belief in each other. Thomas, the Titan of industry, found a new kind of strength, one that was quieter, more profound. The ruthlessness he had once reserved for the boardroom was now tempered by a fierce, protective gentleness. Elena, having walked through the valley of the shadow of death, had emerged with a purpose that burned brighter than ever. Her trauma had not broken her. It had made her a voice for the voiceless. And Maya blossomed. The haunted, watchful girl from the streets was gone. In her place was a young woman with a quick, intelligent mind and a spirit that had proven unbreakable. She devoured books, engaged in fiery debates with Elena over politics and philosophy, and shadowed Thomas as he began to lay the groundwork for their new life's work. That work was the Beckett Foundation. It was not a typical philanthropic enterprise, a way for a billionaire to soothe his conscience with tax-deductible donations. It was a weapon repurposed for peace. With an initial endowment of $1 billion from Thomas's personal fortune, its mission was twofold: to provide aid, legal support, and safe havens for the victims of human trafficking and global corruption, and to fund the kind of fearless, independent journalism that could prevent another Black Triangle from ever taking root in the darkness. Leora Bentley became the Foundation's first director of investigative grants, her fierce determination now backed by near-limitless resources. Julian Price offered a full pardon for his cooperation, led their data security division, creating an unhackable platform for whistleblowers to share information safely. Their army of shadows had become an army of light. One cool autumn afternoon, Maya found Elena in the newly rebuilt greenhouse, a place Elena had always called her sanctuary. She was tending to a bed of orchids, her hands once chained now moving with a gentle, practiced care. "I've decided what I want to do," Maya said, her voice clear and steady. Elena turned a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I think I already know. I want to be a journalist." Maya said the words full of a certainty that felt as solid as the earth beneath her feet. "Like Leora. Like you were. I spent so much of my life being invisible, being the person nobody listened to. I want to spend the rest of it finding the people who are still hiding in the shadows and giving them a voice." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She pulled Maya into a fierce embrace, her heart swelling with a love and pride so powerful it almost took her breath away. "My darling girl," she whispered into Maya's hair, "you already have." The story concluded 1 year to the day after Maya had first approached Thomas in the memorial garden. The three of them stood on the terrace watching the sunrise paint the sky. The air was crisp and clean. A new granite bench had been installed in their private garden, replacing the public one that had marked a life that was never truly lost. The inscription was different now. It read, "To those who speak for the silent. Your voice is the dawn." Thomas slid his arm around Elena's waist, his other hand resting on Maya's shoulder. They were not the same people who had been shattered by grief and loss. They were survivors, their scars a map of their journey, a reminder not of their pain, but of their strength. Maya was no longer the frightened girl in the rain. She was a young woman on the cusp of a future. She would write herself her place at Columbia's School of Journalism already secured. Elena was no longer a ghost, but a beacon of hope for countless others. And Thomas was no longer just a billionaire. He was a husband, a father, a man who had been given a second chance at life and had chosen to build something with it that would outlast any monument of stone or steel. They did not speak. They simply stood together, a family of three, and watched the sun climb higher, burning away the last of the shadows. The storm was over. The war was won. And in the quiet, breathtaking beauty of the new day, they had finally truly come home. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with the roar of cannons, but with the whisper of a single courageous voice. The story of Thomas, Elena, and Maya is a testament to the enduring power of hope in a world that often seems shrouded in darkness. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. True strength is not measured by the empires we build for ourselves, but by the hands we extend to those who have fallen, by the voices we amplify when others try to enforce silence. The world is full of shadows, and there will always be those who seek to profit from the dark. But there is a light in the human spirit that, once ignited, can never be truly extinguished. It is the light of empathy, the fire of justice, the quiet, stubborn belief that even after the longest night, the dawn will always come. We must only be brave enough to look for it, and brave enough to share it when we find it. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength we all carry within us, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. There are many more stories to be told, many more voices that deserve to be heard. Your support allows us to continue bringing them to light. Thank you for watching.